Hey, what's up? This is Nick with Rider Magazine, and today we're out here talking about something very special. The 2021 Honda CBR1000RR-R Fireblade SP. So as you guys know, that this is Honda's leading flagship superbike lineup, and it is all new for the 2021 model year. Now, importantly, Honda's really done a ground-up revision, and they've also changed their philosophy with the actual design of the bike. The SP represents a shift in Honda's whole approach to superbikes, where they've gone with a track bike first and road bike second design philosophy. So what that means is a bike that is far more pointed in a track scenario, which means it's far more sporty, and it's given up a little bit of those creature comforts that the original CBR, dating all the way back to the 900RR that was released in 1992, always had. Now, importantly, they did retain a lot of those well-liked Honda qualities. It's still a very nimble and very approachable machine, but everything about this bike kicks it up just a few notches and takes that extra step of edginess that Honda really needs to compete on the world stage and in World Superbike, which is exactly what this bike was designed to do. So we're going to get into this first ride review, and I hope you guys stick around. So as I mentioned before, this is an all-new setup and an all-new philosophy from Honda. And really that starts with Honda bringing in the expertise of members from HRC, or Honda Racing Corporation, and more specifically the MotoGP division of HRC. So a lot of what you see in this engine derived from the limited edition $186,000 RC214V-S that was released in 2015. If you guys remember, that bike was actually designed and inspired by Marc Marquez's championship winning bike. So of course we have a big bore short stroke engine configuration, which always leads to high revs, high horsepower. They've adopted a finger follower valve train, titanium conrods, forged pistons. There's a lot of really cool technology in this motor. Now, importantly, this thing was designed to run at high revs on the racetrack, but that still doesn't make it a bad motor for the street, which is exactly where I focused my review. Because after all, this bike is a street legal bike, and we took it to the canyons and did some riding on it. And overall, as you might expect with a kind of big bore short stroke configuration, a lot of its power lives up in the top end range. But we put it on the dyno to really see what it can do, and it puts out 175 horsepower and about 78 foot-pounds of torque with the US map specifically. Now, Euro versions can put up numbers that are just knocking on the door of 200 HP at the rear wheel, but in America we get kind of the decaf tune, which is mainly aimed at satisfying noise emissions, not so much carbon emissions, but really noise emissions from this awesome titanium Akrapovic exhaust, which, by the way, sounds absolutely brilliant. Once you get up above about 6,000 RPM, that exhaust valve opens up, and it sounds awesome. So backtracking just a hair, let's go back to how this engine feels. Now, as I said before, it kind of has that typical inline four characteristic that really dates back to early inline four motors, where all of its power lives at the top. And because of that emissions tune that it does have, it's even more pronounced. And once you do get it at about 7,000 RPM, this thing lights off and just takes off. You can feel all of that power coming through, and it's nice and smooth, very linear and tractable. And that's sort of those Honda qualities coming back into play here, where it's still a very high performance machine, but still approachable in that regard. And then it just pulls all the way to its 5,000 RPM, and really it stops making power at about 12,000 RPM. Again, that's the emissions tune talking. But overall, if you get into canyons, you can easily keep the revs up at about seven-ish grand. You get that whiff of mid-range, and it's just enough to really just exit those corners nice and hard. And it's something that I really enjoy about this bike. And then you have the soundtrack to really just elevate the whole experience. So it is very cool on the street still. Now, of course, one of the other things that Honda has done this year is just the gearbox is completely redesigned, and it has a new up and down quick shifter, which, to be totally honest, I think is probably one of the best that I've ever used. I've always regarded Ducati and Aprilia quick shifters as being very well sorted, but this SP's quick shifter is pretty much there as far as the top that I've sampled in recent years. Now, next thing I want to talk about is the chassis, which again, totally redesigned. So you have a brand new frame, brand new swing arm, new geometry for the CBR, and it's totally different from previous generations. This bike is 2 inches longer in the wheelbase, so it brings it up to a 57.3 inch wheelbase, if I remember correctly. It has a slightly longer rake and a little bit more trail. Now, a lot of you viewers will think, well, longer geometry, that usually makes for a slower handling bike. And in most cases, you would be correct. However, Honda has been able to keep most of the CBR's very, let's say, well-established handling and instilled it in this machine by doing a couple really trick things. So first, they've actually raised the center of gravity a little bit by raising the engine up higher. So it gives you a little bit more leverage when you're flicking the bike side to side. The other thing that they've done is they've actually brought it back just a hair to help balance weight distribution. Now that's really important when you're coming into a corner, you get on the brakes, and vice versa when you're accelerating. It keeps the bike more evenly distributed. That's a very key thing. But by raising that center of gravity, raising that motor up, like I mentioned before, you get some of that agility back. Now, is it as nimble as the previous CBR1000RR, the 2017 into 2020 for the United States market? Not quite. It's probably about 90% there. And I think you could probably get a little bit of that agility back by moving to lighter wheels. This bike has cast aluminum instead of forged. And as you know, reducing unsprung weight will always make it more agile. Of course, since we're talking about the chassis, let's go ahead and talk about the Öhlins electronic suspension. Now, it is a semi-active suspension, and this has pretty much become the gold standard in superbikes of today. Your damping is automatically adjusted. You have 3 levels, automatic 1 through 3, and then you have manual levels, manual 1 through 3 as well. Now, it's really important to recognize that because automatic level 1 is designed for track, automatic level 2 is sport, automatic 3 is rain. And the damping characteristics change accordingly. I really enjoyed automatic level 2, which is the sport mode, on the street. I think it kept the chassis nice and taut, but you know, as you know, on canyon roads, they're a little bit beat, and you know, it deals with it well. Track, a bit too stiff for my liking on the road, but in a racetrack setting, I'm sure it'd work out great. And then rain was actually good for just commuting around and just gobbling up all those impurities in the roadway. And what I really like about the chassis and suspension overall is just the sheer amount of mechanical grip that you get. So it gives you loads of confidence to really put the bike on its nose, get into a corner, and you have all that grip coming through and feedback as well. And in the rear, you know, accelerating, driving hard out of corners, it works out very, very well. Again, a lot of that Honda DNA is showing itself in this, but you get more stability, a little bit less agility, but the compromise there is it makes a much more planted machine, and I'll definitely make that exchange every day of the week. So the other thing I would like to talk about is the electronics. With this new bike, the electronics are completely revamped, and if you guys are curious, yes, it is a cut above anything that was on the previous generation Honda. Now, the reason it is such a vast improvement, and I can tell this just by simply riding it on the street and not even testing the limits of traction control on the racetrack, is because Honda has gone to a true 6-axis IMU. If you guys think back to the 17 to 20 CBR1000RR, used a 5-axis IMU and the 6th axis was calculated. What that did is it created some erratic behavior, especially on the racetrack when you're getting on the brakes. ABS intervened a little bit too early, traction control was inconsistent. But in this case, and again, not even testing the limits, I can tell how much more tractable and fluid it is between each level. Now, what I can tell right away just by riding on the street is the throttle response much better there. And overall, I think the electronics package, when pushed at the racetrack and really put to the test, is going to be significantly better. Again, that's another step in that more aggressive mindset for Honda, something that I really appreciate. Now, kind of the last things I want to talk about are ergonomics. If you guys think back to even the CBR900RR, some of the early 1000s, they've always done a really good job of keeping the bike relatively comfortable, because after all, it is a street bike. You're going to be riding it on the street, whether you're street rider, track day guy, club racer. There was a semblance of comfort that just wasn't really represented in the CBR's competitors. But that's kind of been pushed to the side. Now, the seat to peg ratio is much shorter. If you're a taller rider, you're probably going to feel a little bit cramped. I stand at 5'10", 32-inch inseam, pretty average dimensions in that regard, and I'm fairly comfortable on it. In fact, I actually really like this more aggressive setup because you can manipulate the bike to a much higher degree. So it has a slightly higher seat height, a little bit above 32 inches. Again, not that big of a deal. They've kept the tank seam, where it seams to the seat, pretty narrow, so I can still get my boots on the ground very comfortably. And they've also lowered the tank as well, so you can tuck in. Now, importantly, and this is a big one, the clip-on handlebars are lowered pretty significantly, and they're much wider, so you get much more leverage. Now, for me, I prefer that racier position, because when you do get into the canyons, you do start having some fun, that's where it really, really shines, and you're able to just get in that hunker down position and have a good time. On the street, when you're in traffic, it can be pretty taxing. You know, it's going to get pretty wristy if you're slogging along on the 405 or something like that. But again, think this bike is designed to be much more pointed, much more aggressive, and much more focused than previous iterations of the CBR. So last thing I kind of want to touch on is the brakes. Of course, you get 330 millimeter rotors, Brembo stylemic calipers, and brake feel and power is a step up from the previous generation CBR as well. So wrapping it up here, you know, yes, this bike is more aggressive than previous iterations, but that's because it needs to go to World Superbike and compete at a much more elevated game. Other manufacturers have been putting out limited edition, homologated motorcycles like the ZX-10RR, the Ducati V4R, Aprilia has done a number of those. And it's something that the CBR, while a very good bike and accomplished a great many things, club racing and American racing, it's won the Isle of Man multiple times. On the world stage, it only claimed the title a couple of times in its long and very rich and very successful history. And this bike is aiming to change all that, and it's aiming to bring home the bacon for Honda. Now, with that said, I really enjoyed it, even on the street. I like the fact that it is more aggressive riding position, has a bit more bite with the engine, and it's just that extra step everywhere. It's got a little bit more attack everywhere. Uncorked, I think it could be really cool, but let's be honest, 175 HP is more than I need any day of the week. Now, if you guys have any questions, go ahead and drop them down below and we'll get you some answers. And the last thing I want to do is remind you guys to be safe out there. Now, take care.